first time seeing a naked man, the rancher teased, and the Apache girl quickly turned away. She grew up learning that land was not owned. It was borrowed, respected, and protected. Alina's grandmother used to say the ground listened to footsteps, and that careless people left scars behind them. Alina carried those words with her as she drove the dusty road toward the ranch, her old truck rattling with every stone it crossed. To her left stretched dry hills and scrub, familiar and calm. To her right stood fences that marked a different way of living. Alina was Apache, raised on stories, silence, and careful observation. She was in her early 20s, old enough to know who she was, but still young enough to feel out of place when she stepped beyond her community. She had agreed to work on the ranch for one season, not because she wanted to, but because she believed it mattered. The tribal council wanted someone calm, educated, and patient to help reduce tension with nearby landowners. Alina had been chosen because she listened more than she spoke. The ranch belonged to Luke Harper, a man people described as difficult but fair. He had lived on that land most of his life. His father had run cattle there before him, and his grandfather before that. To Luke, the land was proof of survival. Every fence post he set into the earth felt like a promise that his family's hard work meant something. He did not think much about borders beyond what the law said. Luke was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, and worn down by years of physical labor. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving behind an empty house and a quiet that never quite lifted. Since then, his days followed a strict pattern. Wake before dawn, tend to the animals, fix what was broken, and end the day with little more than the sound of wind moving through dry grass. When Alina arrived at the ranch, Luke was repairing a gate. He straightened when he heard the truck, wiping sweat from his face with his sleeve. He did not smile at first. He had agreed to the arrangement because the county insisted, not because he wanted someone watching his land. "You must be Alina," he said, his voice low and cautious. She nodded. "Yes, thank you for letting me work here." He noticed how she stood, straight but not stiff, her eyes alert but calm. She wore plain clothes and sturdy boots, nothing meant to draw attention. There was a quiet confidence about her that made him unsure how to respond. "Well," he said after a moment, "work starts early. Ranch doesn't wait for anyone." "I understand," she replied. From that day on, they shared space but little conversation. Alina helped with record keeping, walked the land to note damaged fencing near the boundary, and translated during meetings when elders visited. She moved carefully, always aware of where she stepped. Luke watched her from a distance, unsure what to make of her presence. She did not complain about the heat. She did not rush her tasks. She treated the land with a kind of respect he had never seen from hired hands. To Alina, the ranch felt heavy with history, but not all of it kind. She could feel where the land had been pushed too hard, where water had been diverted, where old paths had been erased. Still, she did not judge Luke harshly. She saw a man shaped by loss and responsibility, carrying burdens he did not speak about. Some evenings after the work was done, Alina sat alone near the edge of the property, watching the sky change color. The sunset reminded her of home, of stories told by firelight. She missed the sound of her grandmother's voice, steady and wise. Working here was not easy, but she believed it mattered. Understanding began with being present, even when it was uncomfortable. Luke, on the other hand, struggled with her silence. He was used to workers who talked loudly or joked to pass the time. Alina's quiet made him feel exposed, as if she could see more than she said. He caught himself wondering what she thought of him, of the ranch, of the fences that cut across land she once roamed freely. During one long afternoon, they worked side by side repairing a section of fence damaged by a storm. The sun beat down, and the air felt thick and slow. Luke handed her tools without speaking. She accepted them with a nod. Their movements fell into an easy rhythm, unplanned but efficient. "You've done this before," Luke finally said. Alina nodded again. "Not fences like this, but my uncle taught me how to fix things that break." Luke grunted, half amused. "Good skill to have." That small exchange stayed with him longer than he expected. It was simple, but it felt like a bridge, narrow but real. Alina noticed the change too. Luke seemed less tense, less guarded. He still spoke little, but his tone softened. She began to see the ranch through his eyes, not just as a place of conflict, but as a home built from years of effort and loss. She reminded herself that understanding did not mean agreement. It meant seeing the full picture. As days passed, the ranch settled into a steady rhythm. Morning chores, midday heat, quiet evenings. Alina kept notes, marking areas where old paths once ran, places where animals crossed naturally. She hoped her work would help both sides find balance. One morning, Luke watched her kneel near a dry creek bed, touching the soil gently. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Water remembers where it used to flow," she said, "even when it's gone." Luke frowned, then looked more closely at the ground. He had lived there for decades, yet he had never thought of it that way. Something shifted inside him, subtle but important. By the end of the first week, neither of them felt like strangers anymore, but neither felt like friends. They existed in a careful space between. Alina knew she was walking on ground shaped by history and hurt. Luke knew he was being asked to see beyond what he had always known. Neither of them could guess how one small moment, unexpected and awkward, would test that fragile understanding. For now, they worked, watched, and listened, unaware that the quiet balance they had built was about to be challenged in a way neither had planned for. The heat arrived early that day, heavier than usual, pressing down on the land as if the sky itself was tired. By mid-morning, the sun had already burned away the last cool traces of night. The cattle moved slowly, and even the birds were quiet. Alina felt it as soon as she stepped out of the small room she was staying in near the barn. Days like this demanded patience and care. The land could become unforgiving if treated without respect. Luke had been awake since before dawn. A pipe near the lower pasture had leaked overnight, and he spent hours fixing it, crawling through dirt and sharp grass. By the time the water flowed correctly again, his shirt clung to him, soaked through with sweat and dust. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, staring at the creek nearby. The water ran low but clear, moving over smooth stones. He told himself he would just rinse his face and arms, nothing more. The ranch was quiet, and Alina usually worked farther up the boundary in the mornings. He walked toward the creek, boots heavy, mind already drifting to the list of tasks still waiting for him. Alina, meanwhile, had been sent to check fence markers near the same area. She carried a notebook, stopping every few steps to write something down. She followed an old path that curved closer to the creek than she realized. Her thoughts were focused on her work, on measurements, on notes she would later share with the council. The sound of water grew louder, but she barely noticed. When she rounded a cluster of trees, she froze. Luke stood near the water, turned slightly away, clearly not expecting anyone. The moment lasted only a second, but it felt much longer. Alina's breath caught. Her eyes dropped instantly to the ground. She turned away so fast she nearly lost her balance. I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice tight and embarrassed. Luke spun around, startled. "Whoa, hey, I didn't know anyone was out here." There was a pause, the kind of pause that stretches, thick and uncomfortable. Trying to break the tension, Luke spoke without thinking. "What, never seen a man caught off guard before?" The words came out light, almost joking, but the moment they left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. Alina said nothing. Her face burned with embarrassment, but more than that, with discomfort. She kept her back turned, staring at the trees ahead as if they were the most important thing in the world. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." She walked away quickly, her steps controlled but fast. Luke stood there, watching her retreating figure, a strange mix of regret and confusion settling in his chest. The creek no longer felt refreshing. The air felt heavy, thick with something he could not name. Alina did not stop until she reached the open field beyond the trees. Only then did she pause, pressing her hand lightly against her chest to steady her breathing. Her grandmother's teachings echoed in her mind, about boundaries, about dignity, about how some moments carried lessons whether one wanted them or not. She felt embarrassed, yes, but also unsettled. Not because of what she saw, but because of how quickly the space between respect and carelessness had revealed itself. To her, modesty was not just about appearance. It was about intention, about awareness. She finished her work that morning in silence, keeping her eyes down and her thoughts guarded. When she returned to the main area of the ranch, she avoided places where she might run into Luke. Her movements became careful again, measured. The easy rhythm they had begun to form felt broken. Luke noticed immediately. At lunch, he sat alone at the table, pushing food around his plate without appetite. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind. The surprise, her quick turn away. The look not of anger but of discomfort. He realized then how different their worlds truly were. What he had meant as a harmless comment carried weight he hadn't considered. He hadn't meant to embarrass her, and yet he had. The rest of the day passed slowly. When they crossed paths in the afternoon, Alina gave a brief nod and nothing more. Her voice, usually calm, sounded distant when she spoke. Luke felt the change like a shift in the weather, subtle but impossible to ignore. By evening, the silence between them felt heavier than before. Luke leaned against the fence as the sun dipped low, watching Alina walk toward her truck. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, an apology maybe, but the words refused to come. He wasn't sure how to say them without making things worse. Alina drove away with the windows down, letting the wind cool her face. She told herself it was nothing, just an awkward moment. These things happened when different worlds crossed. Still, her chest felt tight, as if a door had closed somewhere she hadn't expected. That night, she called her aunt, her voice steady but thoughtful. She didn't describe the moment in detail. She didn't need to. Sometimes people don't know our ways, her aunt said gently. That doesn't always mean harm, but it does mean we must decide how close we allow them to stand. Alina lay awake long after the call ended, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Luke, not as the man by the creek, but as the quiet rancher who worked without complaint, who listened more than he spoke. She wondered if he understood why the moment mattered. Luke, on the other side of the ranch, sat on his porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He had lived alone for years, grown used to speaking without thinking too much about how his words might land. He realized now that being alone had shaped him in ways he hadn't noticed. The land between them remained the same, silent, patient, watching. By morning, nothing had been said, but everything felt different. The ranch moved forward as it always did, but the easy balance they had been building had shifted. Both of them felt it. Both of them wondered what would come next. Neither knew yet that silence could be just as important as words, and that how they handled what followed would decide whether understanding could grow or quietly fade away. The next few days passed with a careful kind of quiet. Nothing was spoken about what had happened, yet it lived between them like a thin line drawn in the dust. Alina arrived early each morning and left before sunset when she could. She focused on her work with extra attention, as if order and routine could smooth out what felt unsettled inside her. Luke noticed the change right away. Before, Alina's silence had felt calm. Now it felt guarded. She answered questions politely but briefly. She no longer lingered near the fence in the evenings or sat watching the sky. When their paths crossed, she kept her eyes lowered, respectful but distant. Luke felt a dull weight settle in his chest. He told himself to leave it alone, that time would fix it. But time, instead of easing things, made him think more. He found himself remembering small details. The way she always closed gates carefully, making sure they latched. The way she picked up loose wire without being asked. the way she paused before stepping onto the land, as if greeting it. These were not things people usually noticed. He had noticed them because he had been paying attention, even before he realized it. Alina spent more hours walking the boundary lines alone. She checked markers, wrote notes, and studied the way animals moved across the land. Being alone helped her breathe again. The land did not judge. It simply existed. She knelt by dry earth and listened to the wind. She reminded herself why she was there, not for comfort, not for approval, but for balance. Still, her thoughts returned to the ranch house more often than she liked. She wondered if Luke understood why she had reacted the way she did. She wondered if he thought she was being distant on purpose. She did not want conflict. She wanted respect. Sometimes, she thought, those two things were easily confused. One afternoon, Luke found an old section of fence completely down. A storm from the night before had knocked it loose, and cattle tracks showed animals had already wandered close to the boundary. He stood there, rubbing the back of his neck, calculating how long the repair would take alone. He could ask Alina for help. She was capable, but he hesitated. Finally, he walked toward her truck, which was parked near the shed. "There's a fence down near the west line," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "If you're free." Alina looked up from her notes. For a moment she studied his face as if weighing something unseen. Then she nodded. "I can help." They walked together without speaking. The sun hung high and the air shimmered. When they reached the broken fence, they worked side by side in silence. Luke held post steady while Alina secured the wire. Their movements were careful, practiced. There was no awkwardness in the work itself, only in what remained unsaid. At one point, Luke's hand slipped and the wire snapped back lightly against his glove. He cursed under his breath. Alina paused. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "No, just careless." She nodded and went back to her task. But that small exchange stayed with him. It reminded him that concern could exist without closeness, and that respect could be shown quietly. As the fence took shape again, Luke felt the weight of his thoughts pressing harder. He realized that saying nothing was not the same as fixing something. The land taught him that. Ignored damage only grew worse with time. When the fence was done, Alina stepped back to inspect their work. "It will hold," she said. Luke took a breath. "Alina." She turned, her expression calm but reserved. "I shouldn't have said what I said the other day," he began. The words felt stiff but honest. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean any disrespect." She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause. Luke feared he had waited too long. "Thank you for saying that," she replied at last. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I didn't think you meant harm, but where I come from, some moments carry more weight than people realize." He nodded. "I'm starting to understand that." They stood there, the repaired fence between them, solid and straight. It felt like more than a barrier now. It felt like a reminder. After that day, things did not return to how they were before, but they changed. The distance remained, yet it softened. Alina no longer avoided shared spaces completely. Luke became more careful with his words, more aware of the space he occupied. They spoke when necessary, and sometimes when the moment felt right, a little more. One evening, clouds gathered suddenly, dark and heavy. A storm rolled in faster than expected, and rain began to fall hard and cold. Alina was far from the main buildings, checking markers near a low ridge. Luke spotted her truck still parked by the shed and felt a jolt of concern. He drove out to find her just as the rain turned fierce. They took shelter under a wide outcropping of rock, the sound of rain loud and steady around them. For a while, they said nothing. The land drank deeply, the earth darkening with moisture. Luke broke the silence. "My wife used to love storms like this," he said, surprising himself. Said the land needed to cry sometimes. Alina listened. She did not rush him. "She passed 5 years ago," he continued. "After that I stopped noticing things, just did the work, thought that was enough." Alina nodded slowly. Grief changes how we see the world, she said. In my culture, we sit with it, we don't rush it away. He considered her words, watching the rain. I didn't know how. The storm eased after a while, leaving the air fresh and cool. When they stepped out, the land looked renewed, as if breathing easier. From that moment on, something settled between them. Not friendship, not closeness, but understanding. Alina felt lighter. Speaking did not erase what had happened, but it placed it in context. She saw Luke not just as a rancher, but as a man shaped by loss, trying to find his way. Luke saw Alina not just as a quiet worker, but as someone carrying generations of wisdom, choosing patience even when it cost her comfort. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Still careful, still respectful, but steadier. Neither of them knew what the rest of the season would bring. They only knew that silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like space, intentional, thoughtful, and shared. And sometimes, that was enough to let understanding take root. The weather changed again a few days later, in a way no one expected. The morning began clear and quiet, with pale light resting gently on the land. Alina checked the forecast on her phone before heading out, but the signal was weak, and the information incomplete. She decided to finish one last survey near the far ridge before returning. Luke was busy repairing a storage shed and did not notice how dark the sky slowly became. By early afternoon, the wind picked up. It came in strong bursts, bending grass and rattling loose metal. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, covering the sky in shades of gray. Alina felt the shift immediately. The land always spoke before the storm arrived. She packed her notebook and started walking back, but the distance was longer than she remembered. The rain began suddenly, hard and cold. Within minutes, the ground turned slick and visibility dropped. Alina pulled her jacket tighter and kept moving, but the wind pushed against her, slowing every step. She could still see the outline of an old line cabin not far away, a structure once used decades ago and now mostly forgotten. She headed toward it, knowing it was better than standing in the open. Luke noticed the storm when thunder cracked sharply overhead. He dropped his tools and looked toward the ridge. Alina's truck was not in sight. A tight feeling formed in his chest. Without wasting time, he grabbed his coat and keys and drove out, rain pounding against the windshield. Alina reached the cabin just as the storm grew worse. The door creaked but opened. Inside, the space was small and dusty but dry. She lit a small lantern kept there for emergencies and waited, listening to the storm rage outside. Time passed slowly. She hoped Luke would not worry. He found her truck parked near the old path and felt both relief and concern. Leaving his vehicle, he followed the trail on foot until he saw the faint glow of light through the cabin window. He knocked once, firmly but not loud. Alina opened the door, surprised but calm. "I thought you'd still be at the shed," she said. "I saw the storm coming," Luke replied. "Didn't want you caught out here alone." She stepped aside to let him in. The cabin smelled of old wood and earth. Luke shook the rain from his coat and looked around. "Haven't been in here since I was a kid," he said quietly. The rain showed no sign of stopping. Thunder rolled steadily, close enough to feel in the chest. Luke found dry wood stacked in one corner and started a small fire in the old stone pit. Soon the space filled with gentle warmth and soft light. They sat across from each other, the fire between them. The flickering light softened the room, casting long shadows on the walls. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence, steady and calming. Alina broke the quiet first. "My grandmother used to say storms remind us that we are small," she said. "Not weak, just part of something bigger," Luke nodded slowly. "My father said storms showed what you forgot to prepare for," she smiled faintly. "Both can be true." The fire crackled. Luke stared into it, then took a breath. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about this land, about you being here." Alina listened. "I used to think understanding meant knowing facts," he continued. "Rules, lines on maps. But I'm starting to see it's more than that. She looked at him then, really looked. His face carried lines carved by sun and years, but his eyes held something softer now, thoughtful. "When I was younger," Alina said, "I thought respect meant staying quiet, staying out of the way. Now I think it also means speaking when it matters." Luke met her gaze. "Then I'm glad you stayed." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't realize how alone I'd become until you showed up. Not just alone out here, but in how I saw things." Alina considered his words. "Loneliness can make people build walls," she said. "Sometimes fences, sometimes habits." He smiled gently at that. "I built plenty of both." The storm outside softened into a steady rain. The fire warmed the room enough that the cold no longer mattered. The quiet between them felt different now. Not tense, not distant, just open. Luke spoke again, his voice lower. "I'm not asking you to agree with how things have always been done here. I just want to understand better." Alina nodded. "Understanding doesn't mean losing who you are," she said. "It means making space for someone else's truth." They sat with that thought. The fire burned low, steady, and calm. In that small cabin, two lives shaped by different histories shared a moment that asked nothing more than honesty. When the rain finally slowed, the sky outside had turned deep blue, the storm moving on. Luke stood and stretched. "We should head back before it gets dark." Alina agreed. Before leaving, she looked once more at the fire, then gently covered it, leaving only warmth behind. They walked back together under clearing skies, the land fresh and quiet. No promises were made, no paths decided, but something important had shifted. The ranch waited, the land patient as always, and both of them returned changed, carrying truths spoken softly by firelight, ready for whatever came next. The days that followed felt quieter but not empty. The storm had passed, and with it, something heavy had lifted from the land. The mornings came cool and clear, the sky wide and pale. Alina returned to her routine, but now her steps felt lighter, as if she were walking with steadier balance. Luke noticed it too, though he did not say anything. He had learned that some changes were best respected in silence. Work on the ranch continued as always. Gates needed checking, animals needed care, notes needed updating. Yet there was a new ease in how they moved around each other. They spoke when necessary and sometimes when it felt natural. Their conversation stayed simple, about weather, repairs, and the land, but there was meaning beneath the words. Respect had found its place, quiet and steady. Alina's time on the ranch was coming to an end. She had known this from the beginning, but now the thought carried weight. Her reports were nearly complete. The council would soon review her notes and begin the next steps. She felt proud of the work she had done, not because it solved everything, but because it opened doors that had been closed for too long. One afternoon, Alina sat near the edge of the property, reviewing her final pages. Luke approached slowly, careful not to disturb her. He leaned against a fence post, watching the land stretch out before them. "You'll be leaving soon," he said. "Yes," she replied. "In a few days," he nodded. "The ranch will feel different." She looked up at him. "So will the land beyond it." They shared a quiet moment, the wind moving softly through the grass. Luke cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about those markers you showed me," he said. "The old paths. I talked to the county about adjusting a few things. Nothing final yet, but it's a start." Alina felt a warmth rise in her chest. "That matters," she said simply. He shrugged, a small smile forming. "You made me see what I'd been walking past for years." As her last day approached, Alina packed her belongings with care. The small room near the barn felt different now, less like a temporary space, more like a chapter closing. That evening, Luke invited her to share a simple meal. Nothing formal, just food and quiet conversation. They sat at the table as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft colors. Luke spoke about his parents, about growing up on the ranch, about how the land shaped him. Alina shared stories of her grandmother, of lessons passed down through generations. They listened, truly listened, without rushing. When the meal ended, Luke stood and handed her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's nothing special," he said, "just something from the land." Inside was a smooth stone, worn by water and time. Alina smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep it." The next morning, Alina loaded her truck before sunrise. The air was cool, the world quiet. Luke walked out to see her off. They stood near the gate, the place where paths separated. "I'm glad you came here," he said. "So am I," she replied. They shook hands, a simple gesture, steady and respectful. Alina climbed into her truck and drove away, watching the ranch grow smaller in her mirror. She felt no sadness, only gratitude. Some encounters were not meant to last forever. They were meant to change something, then let go. Luke watched until the dust settled. The ranch felt quieter but not lonely. He walked the land later that day, noticing details he once ignored, the curve of the ground, the way water gathered after rain. He understood now that ownership was not just about holding on. It was about learning when to step back. Alina returned home with a deeper sense of purpose. She shared her experiences carefully, thoughtfully. Her work became part of something larger, something slow but meaningful. Their lives moved forward on separate paths, but the moment they shared stayed with them, not as regret, not as longing, but as understanding. And sometimes that was the most lasting thing of all.